The year was 1934, and the United States was deep in the throes of the Great Depression. Amidst the economic despair and the dust storms that swept the plains, a new kind of folk hero began to emerge in the headlines of the national newspapers. He was not a violent gangster like John Dillinger, nor a brutal killer like Babyface Nelson, but a man of intellect and charm who viewed the law as a mere puzzle to be solved. His name was Arthur Hayes, but the press and the public would soon come to know him by a far more intriguing moniker. They called him the Postcard Escapee, a name earned through a series of brazen taunts that baffled the Federal Bureau of Investigation and humiliated the most powerful wardens in the country. Arthur Hayes was a man who seemed to vanish into thin air, only to reappear in the form of a colorful picture postcard sent from hundreds of miles away. These were not simple notes of survival, but detailed accounts of his travels and sarcastic critiques of the police officers who were frantically hunting him down. The story of Arthur Hayes is not just a tale of prison breaks and manhunts, but a psychological thriller that played out across the vast landscape of America. It is a story of obsession and arrogance, and a mystery that remains partially unsolved to this very day. Tonight on Midnight Docket, we open the files on the man who turned his flight from justice into a cross-country vacation. To understand the magnitude of the escapes orchestrated by Arthur Hayes, one must first understand the man himself and the era that forged him. Hayes was born into a wealthy family in Newport, Rhode Island, but lost his inheritance in the crash of 1929. Refusing to accept a life of poverty, he turned his brilliant mind toward forgery and counterfeiting. He did not use crude methods or violence, but instead relied on chemistry and art to create banknotes that were virtually indistinguishable from legal tender. By the time the Secret Service finally caught up with him in Chicago in 1932, Hayes had circulated nearly $500,000 in counterfeit currency. The trial of Arthur Hayes was a sensation in itself, as the defendant charmed the jury and frequently corrected the prosecutors on points of law. Despite his charisma, the evidence was overwhelming, and Hayes was sentenced to 20 years in the notorious Blackwood Penitentiary, a federal facility known for its brutal conditions and inescapable walls. The warden of Blackwood was a stern disciplinarian named Warden Silas Thorne, who famously boasted that no man had ever left his prison without his permission. Thorne took a personal interest in Hayes vowing to break the spirit of the arrogant forger and force him into submission. For the first 6 months of his incarceration, Arthur Hayes was the model prisoner. He worked in the prison library and kept to himself while quietly observing every routine and every structural weakness of the facility. Warden Thorne believed he had successfully tamed the sophisticated criminal, but he could not have been more wrong. Hayes was not submitting to authority, he was studying it. He memorized the rotation of the guards and the timing of the delivery trucks and the intricate layout of the ventilation systems. He noted that the laundry truck arrived every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 10 in the morning, and that the driver often left the engine running while signing the manifest. The plan that Hayes devised was so audacious that it sounded like fiction. He realized that escaping the walls was impossible, but walking out the front gate was not if he looked the part. Using supplies stolen from the library and the laundry, Hayes spent weeks fabricating a uniform. He used shoe polish to dye white fabric into a dark navy blue and fashioned a badge out of tin foil and cardboard. The most critical element of his plan was a clipboard which he believed was the ultimate symbol of authority. In the mind of Arthur, Hayes, a man with a clipboard and a confident stride, could walk anywhere he pleased. On a foggy Tuesday morning in November of 1933, the plan was put into motion. Hayes waited for the chaos of the morning shift change in the laundry sector. Slipping into a blind spot behind a row of industrial dryers, he shed his prison grays and donned the crude uniform he had manufactured. He slicked back his hair with grease and picked up his clipboard. With his heart pounding against his ribs, he walked calmly out from behind the dryers and marched directly toward the loading dock where the laundry truck was parked. He did not run or sneak. He walked with the annoyed urgency of a supervisor running late. The guard at the loading dock was a young man named Officer Miller, who had only been working at Blackwood for 3 weeks. When he saw the figure in the dark uniform approaching with a clipboard, he instinctively straightened his posture. Hayes barked a generic order about a missing shipment and pointed aggressively at the manifest on the clipboard. The young guard, flustered and intimidated by the display of authority, stepped aside to let the superior officer pass. Hayes climbed into the passenger seat of the delivery truck just as the civilian driver was returning. With a smooth lie about a ride along inspection, Hayes convinced the driver to take him through the outer gates. It was not until the evening head count that the alarms began to ring at Blackwood Penitentiary. Warden Silas Thorne was apoplectic with rage when he discovered that his prize prisoner was missing. The entire state police force was mobilized, and roadblocks were set up on every major highway leading out of the county. The authorities assumed that Hayes would be hiding in the woods or trying to hop a freight train under the cover of darkness. They scoured the local area with dogs and searchlights, convinced that the forger could not have gone far. But Arthur Hayes was already 300 miles away, enjoying a steak dinner in a diner near the state border. 3 days after the escape, the first postcard arrived at Blackwood Penitentiary. It was a picture of the Statue of Liberty postmarked from New York City. On the back, in elegant cursive handwriting, was a message addressed directly to Warden Thorne. It read, "Dear Warden, the accommodations in New York are vastly superior to your guest house. The food is better and the view is spectacular. Please give my regards to Officer Miller and tell him to stand up straighter. Sincerely, the tourist." The postcard was a slap in the face to the warden and a sensation for the press, who printed the text on the front page of the evening editions. The public reaction was instantaneous and electric. In a time of national hardship, people loved a rebel who could outsmart the system. The moniker "the Postcard Escapee" was coined by a journalist in Chicago, and it stuck immediately. People began to place bets on where the next postcard would come from. Would he go south to New Orleans or west to California? The Federal Bureau of Investigation took over the case, designating Arthur Hayes as public enemy number 1, not because he was dangerous, but because he was making a mockery of federal law enforcement. Federal agents led by a relentless detective named Special Agent Frank Sterling began to track the trail of the postcards. Sterling was a humorless man who saw nothing funny about a criminal running loose. He analyzed the handwriting and the postmarks, hoping to find a pattern. The second postcard arrived 2 weeks later from a beach in Miami, Florida. It depicted a sunny coastline, and the message read, "Dear Warden, having a wonderful time. The weather is divine and the water is warm. I hope the heating system in Block C has been repaired for the sake of my former neighbors. Wish you were here." The tourist. Agent Sterling realized that Hayes was moving fast and using the rail system to cross the country. He alerted railway police in every major city to be on the lookout for a man matching the description of Arthur Hayes. But Hayes was a master of disguise. He used his forgery skills to create fake identification papers and traveled under a dozen different aliases. He dyed his hair and grew a mustache and adopted different accents for each region he visited. He was a ghost who only materialized when he wanted to drop a postcard in a mailbox. The psychological toll on Warden Thorne was immense. He kept the postcards in a drawer in his desk and would stare at them for hours. The humiliation was compounded by the fact that Hayes seemed to know details about the prison that he should not have known. In one card sent from New Orleans, Hayes asked if the warden had finally fixed the squeaky wheel on his office chair. This detail suggested that Hayes had sources on the inside, or was simply so observant that he remembered the smallest minutiae of his captivity. Thorne became paranoid and began firing guards he suspected of being sympathetic to the escapee. As the months rolled by, the chase moved westward. Postcards arrived from the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone National Park, and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Each card was a travelogue of America, as seen through the eyes of a fugitive. Hayes was effectively taking the entire country on a road trip. However, Agent Sterling was closing in. By analyzing the train schedules and the dates on the postmark, Sterling predicted that Hayes was heading toward the Pacific Northwest. The FBI set a trap at the Union Station in Seattle, Washington, flooding the terminal with undercover agents. On a rainy Tuesday in Seattle, the agents spotted a man matching the description of Arthur Hayes boarding a train bound for Vancouver. He was wearing a gray suit and carrying a leather satchel. Agent Sterling signaled for his men to move in. They surrounded the passenger and drew their weapons, shouting for him to freeze. The man raised his hands in terror, dropping his satchel. When they checked his identification, they realized it was not Arthur Hayes, but a traveling salesman who bore a passing resemblance. It was a decoy or a coincidence, but the real Hayes had slipped through the net once again. 2 days later, a postcard arrived at the FBI field office in Seattle, addressed to Agent Sterling. It featured a picture of a totem pole and read, "Dear Agent Sterling, I saw you at the station. You really should wear a raincoat in this weather, or you will catch a cold. Your men are very conspicuous in those trench coats. Better luck next time. The Tourist." This was the first time Hayes had addressed the FBI, directly acknowledging that he knew exactly who was hunting him. It was a chilling realization for Sterling that the quarry was watching the hunter. The cat and mouse game continued for another year. Hayes financed his travels through small-scale forgery and confidence tricks, never staying in one place for more than a few days. He became a legend in the underworld, a man who could not be caught. But the life of a fugitive is exhausting and lonely. The tone of the postcards began to change. They became less mocking and more reflective. A card from the Rocky Mountains spoke of the solitude of the peaks and the cold wind. It seemed that the thrill of the chase was fading, and the reality of a life on the run was setting in. In the winter of 1935, the trail went cold. No postcards arrived for 3 months. The newspapers began to speculate that Hayes had died or fled the country to Mexico or South America. Warden Thorne retired in disgrace, a broken man who never forgave himself for the escape. Agent Sterling, however, refused to give up. He believed that Hayes was still in the United States, hiding in plain sight. He reviewed every file and every clue, looking for the one mistake that every criminal eventually makes. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A clerk at a small post office in a remote town in Vermont reported a suspicious customer who bought large quantities of stamps and seemed overly interested in the pickup times for the mail truck. The description matched an older Arthur Hayes. Sterling immediately flew to Vermont and set up a surveillance operation in the sleepy town of White River Junction. He brought a team of his best agents and ordered them to maintain absolute silence. They watched the post office and the train station for days, waiting for the ghost to appear. On Christmas Eve of 1935, a man in a heavy wool coat and a scarf walked into the post office. He approached the counter and pulled a postcard from his pocket. As he raised his hand to drop it into the slot, Agent Sterling burst through the door with his weapon drawn. The man froze. He did not run or reach for a weapon. He simply turned to face the agent and smiled a sad, weary smile. It was Arthur Hayes. He looked older and thinner, but his eyes still held that spark of intelligence. He held out the postcard to Sterling and said quietly, "I suppose this one is for you." The arrest of Arthur Hayes was the headline news across the country. The postcard escapee had finally been captured. The postcard he was holding was addressed to the American public. It depicted a snowy village scene, and the message was a farewell. It read, "To all my friends, the journey has been long and beautiful, but every vacation must come to an end. I have seen the majesty of this country, and I have tasted freedom. Do not pity me, for I have lived more in 2 years than most men live in a lifetime. Goodbye." The tourist. Hayes was returned to federal custody, but not to Blackwood Penitentiary. He was transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, a prison designed to hold the worst of the worst. The authorities were taking no chances with the man who had walked out of a high-security prison with a clipboard. At Alcatraz, Hayes was placed in solitary confinement and watched 24 hours a day. He was denied access to pens and paper, ensuring that no more postcards would ever embarrass the Bureau of Prisons. But the story of Arthur Hayes did not end in a cell on Alcatraz. Even in the most secure prison in the world, his legend continued to grow. Other inmates treated him with awe, and guards were wary of his intellect. He spent his time reading and studying law, engaging in legal battles to improve the conditions of the prisoners. He became a jailhouse lawyer, drafting appeals for other inmates and challenging the constitutionality of the harsh rules on the island. He had traded his physical escape for an intellectual one, finding a way to fight the system from within the belly of the beast. Years passed and the world outside changed. The Great Depression ended and the Second World War began. Arthur Hayes grew old in prison, his once dark hair turning white. He never attempted to escape again, but he never lost his spirit. In 1952, after serving 18 years of his sentence, he was granted parole due to failing health. He was an old man, now frail and harmless. He walked out of the prison gates not with a clipboard and a disguise, but with a cane and a small suitcase. Upon his release, Hayes moved to a small cottage on the coast of Maine, where he lived a quiet and reclusive life. He refused all interviews with the press and turned down lucrative offers to write his memoirs. He spent his days painting landscapes and walking along the rocky shore. It seemed that the postcard escapee had finally found peace. Agent Sterling, who had long since retired, visited him once. The two men sat on the porch and drank tea, discussing the chase that had defined both of their lives. It was a moment of mutual respect between two adversaries who had pushed each other to their limits. However, there is one final twist to the story of Arthur Hayes. When he passed away in his sleep in 1958, his few belongings were sorted by the executor of his estate. Among his papers, they found a stack of unmailed postcards. They were addressed to various police chiefs and wardens and politicians, but they were never sent. But there was one postcard that was missing. The very last postcard that Hayes had purchased was nowhere to be found in his cottage. 2 weeks after his funeral, a postcard arrived at the headquarters of the FBI in Washington, D.C. It was postmarked from Paris, France. The image was of the Eiffel Tower. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, and cursive, even though the hand that wrote it must have been shaking with age. The message was simple. "Dear Agent Sterling, the view from here is magnificent. You really must see it sometime. The Tourist." The postcard was dated 2 days after Arthur Hayes had supposedly died in Maine. The discovery of the final postcard sparked a frenzy of conspiracy theories. Had Arthur Hayes faked his own death and escaped to Europe for one final adventure? Did he have an accomplice who mailed the card for him as a final posthumous joke? Or was the man who died in Maine not Arthur Hayes at all, but another clever decoy? The FBI investigated, but could find no record of Hayes leaving the country, and the body in the grave was identified as his. Yet the postmark was authentic, and the handwriting was a perfect match. To this day, the mystery of the final postcard remains unsolved. It hangs in a frame in the museum of the FBI, a testament to the man who could not be contained. Arthur Hayes, the postcard escapee, remains one of the most enigmatic figures in American criminal history. He was a criminal who stole nothing but freedom and a jester who made the world laugh at the rigid authority of the law. His legacy is not one of fear, but of wonder, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit craves liberty above all else. As we look back at the legend of Arthur Hayes, we are left with more questions than answers. Was he a villain or a hero? Was he a genius or a madman? Perhaps he was a little of both. But one thing is certain. In an era of gray walls and hopeless days, he brought a splash of color to the world, one postcard at a time. And somewhere out there in the great unknown, maybe, just maybe, the tourist is still traveling, looking for the next beautiful view to share with us all.